My task today is simply to introduce the moderator for our event, who will be in turn introducing our speakers and poets. Sreshtha Sen is a writer from Delhi, India, and one of the editors of the Shoreline Review. She studied literature in English from Delhi University and has an MFA from Sarah Lawrence College, New York. Her work has previously appeared in The Margins, Breakwater Review, Bitch Media, Meridian, and Via Via. It's my great honor to invite Sreshtha to come here. And before she does join us, I wanted to leave us with a couplet from a poet that we both admire, which is Agha Shahid Ali, an Asian American queer poet of great importance. And this is what he has to say, and I think it's a good couplet for us today. Now, friend, the beloved has stolen your words. Read slowly. The plot will unfold in real time. Welcome.
Hi, can you all hear me now? At the back. Louder? Okay. Thank you, Manan, for that introduction. And we know any event that starts with a quote from Shahid is going to be a successful event because Shahid himself said that once. His ego was as great as his poetry. Thank you all for being here, for pre-gaming your pride with our literary event. If you're attending, if you just sit alone on Sundays, crying about how Pride is lonely for Desis, you're not alone. I'm really excited to introduce our first reader for today, Rahul Mehta. Born and raised in West Virginia, Rahul Mehta is the author of the novel No Other World and a short story collection, Quarantine, which won a Lambda Literary Award and AAWW's Asian American Literary Award for fiction. His work has appeared in the Kenyan Review, Epoch, The Sun, Noon, the New York Times Magazine, the International Herald Tribune, Marie Claire India, and on the op-ed page of the New York Times. An Out magazine, Out 100 honorary, Mehta teaches creative writing at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and in the low residency MFA program at West Virginia, Wesleyan College. Please help me welcome Rahul on stage.
Thank you all for being here. Wow, okay. Let me see, how am I gonna do this? Is it okay if I keep my hat on? I know that you're not supposed to wear hats indoors, but I feel like, I just revealed the reason I was wearing a hat, which is I didn't do my hair. And also with the hat on, you can't see how much gray hair I have. So I'm gonna keep it on. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. First off, I just wanted to thank so much the Asian American Writers Workshop, not just for hosting this event, but for all of the amazing work that it does. I mean, really, we are all so fortunate to have the Asian American Writers Workshop doing the work that it does. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of the staff here for organizing this event, and thank you to Sreshtha and Manan and Sindu for being here. So I think I'm supposed to read for about 10 minutes. I think I'm just going to read the first pages of the novel. And I don't think that there probably isn't too much I need to say about it since it's the beginning. Maybe I will just say that the novel, I think maybe is best described as a portrait of an immigrant, an Indian immigrant family in rural America in the 80s and 90s. And the action of the novel sort of moves back and forth between rural Western New York and also a small town in Western India. And I'm going to start with the epigraph, which is a poem by the great Jane Hirshfield. I feel very fortunate that, that Jane Hirshfield gave me permission to reprint the poem in its entirety in my book. You'll see that the title of the book comes from the last line of this poem. And, you know, I'm really proud of this book. There was a period in the middle of writing it where I felt very lost. And I had really sort of lost faith in this book. But when I realized that it was going to have an epigraph by Jane Hirshfield, I thought, oh, well, at least even if the book is terrible, at least everyone gets to read a stunning Jane Hirshfield poem. So, you know, so it gave me at least a little bit of confidence to continue just so I could put it in the front of my book. So here it is, the Jane Hirshfield poem. Within this tree. Within this tree, another tree inhabits the same body. Within this stone, another stone rests. Its many shades of gray the same, its identical surface and weight. And within my body, another body, whose history, waiting, sings. There is no other body. It sings, there is no other world. Is the sound okay? Okay. All right, no other world. Prologue. So let me just say the prologue gives you a glimpse of Western New York in 1985. And then the second part of the prologue jumps forward, I think about 13 years to India. Okay. Prologue, Western New York, 1985. Kiran, 12, almost 13, stood in the tall grasses on the edge of Sherman Road, which rose in a steady incline, climbing past fields, a dairy farm, an evangelical ministry called Ray of Light, housed in a large, boxy building that looked more like a storefront for farm equipment than a place of worship, and a section of the woods he and the other neighborhood kids had always called the cathedral, because of the firs and pines that towered like spires, and the way the light on a sunny day, when they were lucky enough to have one, shot down in beams. At the top of the hill was a T, and you could turn left or you could turn right, but either way you ended up in the same place, back at the main road that headed into town. It was early fall. The leaves had not yet turned. They fluttered in the breeze like winking eyes in day's last light. Fall so suddenly became winter in these parts, winter itself stretching endlessly like an enormous gray carpet being slowly unfurled. Kiran stood midway up the hill, his back to the woods, and across the street was a house, an A-frame, an anomaly among the old wooden farmhouses haunting the lane. The newer houses were farther downhill where Kiran lived, in the small subdivision that pooled off Sherman Road. It didn't occur to Kiran how similar the A-frame was to a dollhouse his older sister Preeti had when they were younger, and which Kiran loved but wasn't allowed to play with since it was Preeti's and he was a boy. When she wasn't hunched over playing with it, she kept it on a high shelf that she had to stand on her bed to reach. It didn't occur to Kiran as he looked at the A-frame, and yet the image must have been there, that high shelf, the bed he wouldn't dare step on, sloshing around in his head in a sea of other images. It had been over 2 weeks now that he had been stopping here, each evening before dusk, just as the light outside was disappearing, but before anyone had thought to draw the curtains. Not that there was much of a need, there being no real foot traffic on this road and no houses on the opposite side. This is what he would see. Amy Bell standing at the kitchen window, washing dishes. Another time at the stove, stirring a pot. The children doing homework in their bedrooms or watching TV, or in the backyard on the trampoline. Who would guess, watching them fly one by one into the air, that in the future one would become a BMX champion, another a large animal veterinarian. A third would marry very young and struggle her whole life with alcohol addiction. And Kelly, the oldest, the smart one, the ambitious one, just 1 year younger than Kiran, would be class president and then study at Duke and then take a job in investment banking in New York and would die when the towers were attacked. And her mother would be very angry for a very long time and would spit unscripted at Kelly's memorial service the following words: "No one knew my daughter. No one. If you think you knew her, you're wrong." And finally, Chris Bell in the living room with a tool in his hand, hunched over something broken. Or at the kitchen table sorting through mail, the light from the pendant lamp making his blonde hair glow in the same way his hair glowed that day 4 years earlier, when Kiran spotted him on the far end of the skylighted food court at the Elmira Mall, a day that would change everything. Kiran had stopped boarding the bus after school. He'd also quit Odyssey of the Mind. Instead, he walked. 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes 4. He wandered. He walked in circles. Sometimes he stopped at home. But he always ended up here, outside this house. Slowly, dusk brushed its murky gray wash across the landscape. Shapes around Kiran became fuzzy, indistinct, crispening by contrast the illuminated rooms of the A-frame house. Tonight, Chris was upstairs in the bathroom, washing away the dirt that his long day as a building contractor had left on him. Kiran had seen him go in there, had watched him unbutton his blue shirt, toss it on the floor, unbuckle his pants, slide them down, move into the shower. Steam clouded the window. Several minutes passed. Images from the faded summer and fall 4 years earlier flashed through Kiran's memory. A 4-armed monster in silhouette, a demon come to life from the Ramayana, emerging from the woods, only to reveal itself to be not a monster at all, but his half-naked sister, swimming in a man's sweater. Days later, Kiran's sister holding a brick, barking, "Look away, Kiran, look away." Another day, Chris Bell's damp, flannel-sleeved arm slung across the back of his pickup truck seat, hovering behind Kiran. And the look on Kiran's mother's face. He'd seen that look twice that summer and fall, and then never again, not quite the same look in all the years that followed. In Kiran's mind, the events of that summer and fall were all connected, and they all came back to this, Chris. The bathroom window turned a steam-blurred beige as a figure approached, curled its fingers under the cracked window, and slid it halfway open. For a second, Kiran could see a strip of Chris's bare, clean skin. And then Chris, aware of the darkness, perhaps even aware of the boy who stood within it, pulled the curtain closed. Western India, 1998. So this is about 14 years later. Or 14. They were not expecting it, even though they had heard the commotion coming toward them on the quiet lane in the afternoon heat. They heard two voices, one deep and strong, the other more tentative, warbling a body call and response folk song. They heard rhythmic clapping, crowds laughing, the ruckus coming closer and closer until it sounded as though it were just outside their house. Still, it had not occurred to them that it was all intended for them until they heard the sudden silence and then 4 sharp raps at the door. When Kiran's older cousin, Bharat, opened the door, leaving the iron security gate shut, what Kiran noticed first was not the woman directly in front of them, and not the girl behind her, but rather the crowd that had formed, that must have followed them, first one curious onlooker, then another. Kiran hadn't been in town long, but he recognized many of the faces, or at least thought he did. He knew firsthand how quickly crowds could form. He'd already experienced it, his first day. The children who lived on the quiet lane spilling out of their houses to gawk unabashedly and unreservedly at the long-haired, brown-skinned, but unmistakably American oddity. And the women and men hovering in doorways or porches, being slightly more discreet, but gawking nonetheless. When his attention finally did turn to the woman at the door, he noticed how she was leaning possessively with her forearm propped against the doorframe. How dirty she was. How dirty she and the girl both were. The oily film on their faces, the heavy makeup, the cheap outfits in shiny, stained synthetic fabrics, inferior versions of the chanya cholis his mother and sister wore to special family occasions. The woman was about 50, he guessed, a little heavy in the hips, and the girl was maybe 15, maybe a little younger, slender and flat-chested, despite presumably passing puberty. Kiran couldn't have known that Guruma was leaning against the doorway, not in some show of dominance, but out of exhaustion. He couldn't have known how she and Pooja had traveled all day, how they had left early that morning, hoping to arrive by noon, but how at the station, where they were to switch buses, the driver of the second bus had refused to let them board. Your kind is not welcome. Even though they had purchased tickets, and despite their protestations, which started off calm, then escalated. By the end of it, Guruma was clutching in tight fists the cloth of her lenga, threatening to lift her skirt, to expose her mutilated genitalia, to curse the driver. "I'll show you," she had said, "and once I do, you will never be the same." But the driver's eyes had been red. He called them disgusting and spat on the floor of the bus and reached behind his seat for some heavy object, a tire iron or a large wrench. Guruma didn't see it clearly, and she thought to herself, "It's not worth it," and unclenched her fists and took Pooja's hand and led her away. Kiran could not have known how they had walked the rest of the way in sandals during the hottest part of the day, or how, when they got to town, they had to perk up, regardless of how withered they felt. They had to sing. They had to dance. They were hijras. Everyone expected a show. Later, Kiran would keep coming back to this moment, the opening of the door, the woman and the girl on his cousin's doorstep. At the time, he didn't notice their Adam's apples. But when he photographed Pooja days later, after the two had told each other their stories, not that they needed to, kindred souls, they had known each other immediately, the way one accustomed to standing outside knows another. It was the feature he focused on most. Pooja in profile, her neck elongated, the setting sun behind her, an arc of light along the mound of her throat, the sharp edge of a crescent moon, that heavenly body, ancient and honest and brave. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. I'll now introduce our second reader for the evening. Sindu will read from her debut novel, Marriage of a Thousand Lies. Sri Lanka-born Sindhu's I Once Met You But You Were Dead, published by Split Lip Press, won the 2016 Turnbuckle Chapbook Contest. A 2013 Lambda Literary Fellow, she has written for Brevity, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Normal School, and Fifth Wednesday Journal. She teaches creative writing at Ringling College of Art and Design. Please help me welcome Sindhu.
All right, can you hear me? All right. I'm sorry if I'm a little nasally. I think I'm allergic to New York. Like, as soon as I got here, I'm just completely stuffed up. I actually haven't read from the beginning of the book, so I'm going to do that. But first, thank you so much to everyone who helped plan this event, and to Sreshtha for moderating, and to Rahul for reading with me. And also to Mark Doden, who's my editor from Soho. He's actually here, for believing in the book. When I was 9, I wanted a short-sleeved, button-down shirt. Amma refused to buy one from the boys' section, pushed me instead toward the pinks and butterflies and the girls. So I told her I needed one for a school play. I wore it open when I biked down hills, the wind slipping its fingers through the loose weave, cooling my sweat through my tank top. My best friend Nisha told me I'd make a cute boy, and her words squeezed something deep inside my bones, pried loose the skin between my legs. Pinpricks, needles, my first lie. The game. Music pumps from the walls and jumps off the tin roof tiles. Gay night at the local dive, and it's a clash of rainbow shirts against walls of dusty license plates. College lesbians and blue-collar queers slide around each other in the hot, coffin-shaped bar. Hands slip numbers over sticky tables. Roaming thumbs hook over edges of rough denim. Drunken tongues on beads of sweat. Lips mix over whispered lies. Skin on skin without room for truths, and this is why we're here. 2:00, Chris says. Don't look. He leans my way over a tall, spindly table and sips his Long Island iced tea through a stirrer held between his teeth. His hair, which he grows out into a swoop over his left eye, falls down between us like a curtain. We've both taken off our wedding rings. Mine rests in a tiny glass tray in our bathroom. Chris's is placed carefully on his nightstand next to his multivitamins. The walls vibrate with the bass, bouncing across my skin. I drink my beer and check my phone, wondering if it's my ex calling, but it's only my mother. Your 2 o'clock or mine? I say. Mine. Chris shakes the hair out of his eyes and points at my phone. Is it Emily? No, I say. I put my phone back in my pocket. It's only been a couple of weeks since Emily and I broke up, but the time has stretched me out. My insides feel ragged and thin. I want the dance floor to swell up with people, the music to climb inside me and wipe my brain clean. Chris stares hard at his glass, now mostly filled with ice, the dark tea slurped down to the last inch. Even at 27, he's still all angles that push at his clothing. I drain the last of my beer and walk toward the bar. Chris's 2 o'clock is a man sitting at the table next to ours in a Red Sox hat and a white Hanes shirt. He holds his Bud Light to his lips, but doesn't drink. I walk up next to a woman on a bar stool whose sad eyes droop down at the outer corners, like they're going to tip the pupils right out of her face. My phone buzzes. I ignore it. The woman smiles at me, her mouth edged in red lipstick. I could take her into a bathroom stall and push her up against the cold brick walls. I think of that red mouth gaping open, lipstick smeared, fingers clutching at me, lips slippery on my fingers and mouth. I smile back. She slides her bar stool closer and touches my arm when she talks, her fingers tingling the skin where I've pushed up the sleeves of my button-down. Chris would say it was worth it. A fuck's a fuck, he would say. My phone buzzes. Amma again. I leave the woman smiling and walk back to where Chris is standing, stirring the ice in his glass around and around. This is the first time we've gone out in months. My unemployment and his busy work schedule as a second-pass message editor for a greeting card company keeps us out of the bars and at home doing normal married people things like Amma always wanted. Chris spends his nights trying to write his own greetings, staring at the cards framed over his desk, the few he got published when he first left engineering and started in this business. I spend my nights drawing commissions for horny suburban fanboys with money to waste, two thin elves facing off against tentacled monsters, custom Sailor Scouts, coy anime girls frolicking at the beach, well-endowed geishas undressing in dimly lit rooms. So, Chris says. He tips his glass back and shakes an ice cube into his mouth. The one at the bar? I don't think so. A fuck's a fuck, he says. He holds the ice cube between his teeth and talks around it. Emily's getting laid. Why shouldn't you? I wish I'd brought another beer so that I'd have something to hold on to, so that the cold of it could take my mind off the ache in my stomach. My hands grasp at the air. The man in the Red Sox hat stares hard at Chris through the darkness of the bar. Emily was no Nisha, Chris says. He raises his empty glass. To Nisha, your oldest and truest. I feel the outline of my phone through my pocket and think about calling Nisha. Red Sox hat seems interested, I say. He's drinking a Bud Light. I haven't spoken to Nisha since my wedding. Haven't had a meaningful conversation with her since we graduated from high school 4 years before that. What would she say if I called her now? He's not bad looking, Chris says, and tucks a piece of hair behind his ear. He looks again at the man, letting his gaze linger. He crunches down on another ice cube. He's coming over. Red Sox hat puts his enormous biceps on our table, which creaks under the pressure. He's younger looking close up, probably still in his early 20s, still in college. Chris sits up a bit straighter. The man smirks at me and says, "Can I buy you a drink?" Before I can react, Chris reaches across the table and folds his fingers over my wrist. "This one's mine," he says. Red Sox hat gets up off the table and looks from Chris to me and back to Chris. "My mistake," he says, and walks back to his table. I wrench myself from Chris's grip. He puts his forehead in his hands. "Sorry," I say. "I thought he was looking at you." Chris nods to the table. I rub my wrist where he held it. We have an agreement that he'll intervene if guys hit on me, but he overdoes it. "I knew these boots were a bad idea," I say. Chris had picked them out. I look straight. "How's this for a greeting?" he says. "Roses are red, violets are blue. Every guy I like just wants to sleep with you." "Wonderful," I said. "You should write greetings for a living." Chris lifts up his head and catches my eye. We laugh at the same time. Our heads tip toward each other and we clutch the table for support. Some of the thinness inside me fades. I feel almost solid. I'm going to read just one other section. Let me tell you something about being brown like me. Your story is already written for you. Your free will, your love, your failure, all of it scratched into the cosmos before you're even born. My mother calls it fate, the story written on your head by the stars, by the gods, never by you. Everyone is watching you all the time, praising when you abide by your directives, waiting until you screw up. And you will screw up. I coasted by for longer than most people. Most stray early, dating in high school or wearing the wrong clothes, maybe piercing something they shouldn't, drinking like hell in college. But then they shape up, put on a suit, and go to their big kid jobs in the swanky part of town, play middle management at biotech and engineering firms, or go to med school. They get married to other brown people and pop out some brown kids, buy a nice cookie-cutter house, and everything is forgiven. As long as you follow your directives in the end, no matter how many lies you have to tell. But here's the truth. I'm still lying. Thank you so much.
Can I invite Rahul and Sindu onto the stage now so that we can become best friends? So I know, Rahul, you spoke a little bit about your book right before reading, but I was wondering to start off if both of you could speak a little bit about your novels, especially in regard to the research that went into it, or if any personal experience influenced certain parts of the book.
Okay, I can start. So my novel started, so it's about my protagonist, her name is Lucky. She's a Sri Lankan American Tamil lesbian living in and around Boston. That's where the novel takes place. And she's married to a gay man who is also Indian for the purpose of seeming straight to their families. So it's a marriage of convenience. And the novel takes place about 4 years after they get married. And this is the point at which their elation at having pulled the wool over everyone's eyes is sort of starting to fade. And they're starting to realize just what they've decided to do. And Lucky goes back home to live with her mother for a couple months to take care of her grandmother who is sick. And while she's there, Lucky reignites this relationship with her old best friend and former lover, Nisha, who is about to get an arranged marriage. So that puts the fire under Lucky in terms of really bringing up questions about her own marriage, questions about, whether or not she should actually come out. And the novel, to me, is a late-in-life coming-out story. And it's a coming-of-age story, except for the fact that Lucky is 27 years old instead of, a teenager. And it really started when my best friend in college asked me to marry him so that we could seem straight to our families and so that, he could get a green card to stay in the country. And we're both queer and both South Asian. And I said no at the time, but the question was something that stayed with me. And I started wondering, what the circumstances would have had to be for me to say yes. And I started to write about it. And that's how I came up with my protagonist, who is very similar to me in a lot of ways, in a lot of superficial ways, but is very different from me in that she has decided to do this thing, to get married to her best friend. So I think in a lot of ways I did do research in that I talked to a lot of South Asian queer people about their experiences, just so that I had a large reservoir to pull from in terms of creating different characters who make different choices. But in a lot of ways, this is also based on my own experience with my family, and I grew up in the Boston Sri Lankan Tamil community, and it's a lot of the culture wars, the intergenerational conflict, all of that is based a lot on my own experience.
So I think with my novel, a lot of it takes place in rural Western New York State, where I lived for a while as an adult. My partner and I both taught for a while at Alfred University, which is like this tiny, tiny, tiny liberal arts college in super rural Western New York. The closest city is Rochester, which is like an hour and a half away. But I think what I really wanted to do with this novel, and something that was a big part of what I wanted to do with it, is I wanted to write about the experience of being an Indian immigrant in rural America. I grew up in West Virginia. I was born in '73, so I grew up in West Virginia in the '70s and '80s, and I really felt like that rural experience of being Indian American was not being represented in the literature. So I wanted to write about that. And I guess the other piece is, as you probably noticed from the second part of the prologue, that one of the main characters in the novel is part of this ancient transgender community in India, the Hijra community. And there's sort of a seed. There are many seeds to this novel, but one of the seeds is something that second scene in the prologue is very similar to something that happened to me when I was in India in, I think it was like 96 or 97. It was one of my first trips to India as an adult. I'd barely been as a kid. I was sort of just discovering India for the first time. I was in my father's like ancestral village, and a hijra came to the door because my cousin was going to have a baby, right? And you know, at the time, I was like, you know, I had like long hair that, not in India, but like in America. Well, when I lived in New York, I'd often wear like these pink barrettes in my hair, and but I wasn't really completely out to my family. Like I was out to my parents and my brother, but like none of my family in India or none of my extended family. And you know, so I was in India visiting my extended family, and you know, this hijra showed up at the door, and I mean, maybe I'm imagining it, I don't know, but our eyes kind of locked, and I think we recognized something in one another. I mean, it's something that I try to get at in that prologue. I mean, I think that sort of, that feeling of being on the outside or being on the other side of the door. But I had not known anything about the hijra community in India up until that point. And so I became really interested. And as soon as I came back to the States, I started researching it. I read as much as I possibly could. I really kind of tried to immerse myself in reading about it for a while. And you know, and then at some point when I really sat down to write the novel, I, you know, having done all that research, I kind of tried to forget the research, you know, and just create a character who felt real to me. Yeah.
Thank you. You were talking about how you were out to your parents, but not certain members of your family. And for the record, I think you'd look dashing in pink berets. There's this quote by an Indian novelist called Sandeep Roy, which I love the quote. It's Desis never really come out of the closet. Their families go into the closet with them. And something I really appreciated in both your books were that you don't attempt to mimic the more conventional coming out narrative that isn't really smooth for most societies. Sindhu, your book deals with completely debunking the myth that there will be no familial collateral damage. So I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit about how you tackle this coming out narrative in your books and what choices you knew you absolutely wanted to make. And Rahul, maybe along with that, you could talk about the letter that's in the book, in case that's not a spoiler.
I love that quote because I think that's definitely true. And I just came to New York from having read in Toronto, and I have a lot of family in Toronto. Most of my mom's family, there's like 100 of them that live there, and some of my cousins were going to come to the reading, and my mom was terrified because she knew that if that happened, the rest of the family would know. And I mean, for me, even though I'm very out, because of the language barrier, because most of my extended family does not speak English, they can't really just go online and Google me and sort of read and know that I'm queer. And so it's really what my parents decide to tell them, which I think is very little. So I'm still like, despite my trying, I'm still in the closet with a lot of my family because I don't really have the words for it to cross that language barrier. I can't, I don't really know how to do that yet. So I'm still struggling with a lot of that. And for me, I wanted to sort of approximate that experience, reflect that experience in the novel. I know a lot of South Asians whose families have been supportive, but I know a lot more whose families haven't. and who have been kicked out of their families, or whose families still like treat them as if they never came out in the first place, which is kind of how my family treats me, as if I never came out in the first place. So I really wanted that complicated narrative, and at every turn, I tried to resist the common coming out narrative that, there's, for a while, there's some, the parents have a hard time, but then they go to PFLAG, and then it's all good. That really doesn't happen with Desi families, and so not a lot anyway, not in my experience. So that's why it's such a complicated question for my narrator whether or not to come out, because she knows that there will be irreparable damage done to her relationship with her family, whether it's her mother, her father, her stepmother. And I really wanted to encompass that experience.
I think for me, first speaking about my personal experience, I've been incredibly lucky. I think my family has been really amazing and accepting, almost from the very beginning. And I've written about this a little bit, but I sort of wrote an essay about this. But my mom was the first. Well, my brother was the first person I told, and then I told my mom when I was I think I was 21 when I told my mom, and much later, I really became aware of all the ways in which my mom kind of made everything okay with all my other family members. She sort of did this amazing mom thing, which is, she just had these quiet conversations with relatives one by one over the months or years or whatever, and kind of just made everything okay for me in ways that I never had to deal with myself. So I ended up not really having to come out to most of my family because my mom actually did it for me, and they were all incredibly supportive. My extended family in India, I had not come out to, which was also really complicated because I've been with my partner for 21 years now, and we traveled to India quite a bit and had been traveling to India a lot. Would see my family, would often stay with them. But we were never explicit about what our relationship was. And then finally in 2010, when my first book came out in India, I also came out to my parents, to my extended family in India. And, their response was like, why did you think that we wouldn't accept this? And in fact, they sort of berated me. They were like, it's you Indians in America who are so conservative. We have no issues with these things. It's you Indians in America, you're so conservative, which in some ways is true. The Indian community in America is really very conservative in a lot of ways. In some ways, much more so than some, or at least my family in India. But, and you wanted to, about the letter, what did you want to?
I just wanted to know if your intention was to make the coming out narrative not the primary narrative. Was that a very intentional thing you wanted to do? Or?
Yeah, it was yeah, so Kiran, the character Kiran is gay, and at some point writes a sort of coming out letter to his parents, which is in the novel. My novel is an omniscient narration, and it follows many of the different family members. In fact, Kiran's mother Shanti is a huge character, and much of the first section really deals with her. I struggled a little bit. I think in early drafts, Kiran was actually even less of the novel. But then as I was sort of working through subsequent drafts, I realized, the novel just needed more of a cohesive, narrative arc that moved throughout the whole book. So I think I sort of beefed up Kiran's role a little bit in the novel. And it did in some ways become a coming of age sort of thing. The letter, the novel's not very autobiographical, but that letter is very similar to a letter I wrote to my dad. So, yeah.
I might have copied a few of those bullet points from the letter into an email draft that's in my inbox right now.
Are you now you have to tell. You tell. What is your experience?
My coming out story?
Or yeah.
There hasn't really been one yet. My if my parents see this live stream, I'm the heterosexual moderator, which has now been ruined. My cover's been blown. I guess I have. I'm going to freak out afterwards. I, sure. Thank you. This is funny because Rahul, before the event, was talking about how he should be careful about what he's saying on stage. And I was like, you'll be fine. Everyone will be fine. You spoke about your omniscient narrator. No, you're fine. I'll be fine. Yes. This is not awkward at all. Going back to what you were talking about, you mentioned in your omniscient narrator, and I think that worked really well for the book when I read it, because like you said, for me, Kiran was not the only protagonist. Pooja, while she doesn't really show up till the later half of the book, is equally significant in Shanti's relationships. But I was wondering, Sindhu, if you could talk about your book, because it is in the first person narrative. And for me, I felt like I never truly understood her friend Nisha's emotions or her mother's emotions, because I was always viewing them through Lucky's lens. And if you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so in the first draft of the novel, I actually had 3 different narrators. All Lucky and her 2 sisters were narrating this book. And Lucky was really young. She was still in college in the first draft, and the novel ended with her coming to this decision to marry Chris. And I had that draft, and I was working on it. I showed it to an agent, and that agent's response was, well, you seem to really just be interested in Lucky's story, so why don't you just tell Lucky's story? And for me, I realized that I had 3 different narrators so that it wouldn't be a queer book, so that it wouldn't be a primarily queer narrative. And I was scared of writing the primarily queer narrative, especially as my first novel. But I threw out that draft and I started over, and I set it 4 years after the marriage so that Lucky's a fully grown adult. And I told it's in first person present tense, so there's a lot of immediacy in the narrative. And it was tough because Lucky is not a very emotional person. She's learned to be very stoic, and she's learned to sort of repress a lot of her emotions and feelings. So I came up against that that obstacle of having to show emotion and other people's emotion, but always having it filtered through Lucky's perspective. And I think it sometimes in the novel it can get sort of oppressive, like this, you're always inside Lucky's head, and it was hard for me to get into that headspace every day just to be able to write it. But I think that for Lucky, it's hard for her as somebody who's trying to have it both ways, who's trying to keep her family happy while at the same time being able to be herself with a marriage of convenience, that it's hard for her to understand Nisha, who has had a lot of relationships with women, but who has agreed to go through with an arranged marriage to a man who, this would not be a marriage of convenience. This would be a real marriage where there are expectations of love and children and, some sort of sex life associated with it. And I think it's hard for Lucky to understand Nisha, and so it becomes kind of hard for us as readers to understand Nisha. What? Oh, okay. But I also think that I know Nisha. I've seen Nisha. I've met Nisha. I've talked to Nisha, many, many Nishas over the course of my life. I know a lot of very close friends who have made similar decisions, and it's tough. It's hard. And to me, Nisha is one of the most tragic characters in the novel because she is making this disastrous decision, but we as readers and Lucky as her friend cannot stop her.
I want to leave enough time for the audience to ask questions, so I'll just ask one more follow-up to that for both of you. You said something about how you didn't want it to be a primarily queer narrative, and I've been thinking a lot about that recently because queerness for South Asians, for people of color, is so multifaceted. I'm from Delhi, and in Delhi, we are trying to encompass queerness with, to complement queerness with any community that's resisting the state. So to battle casteism and Islamophobic naturally becomes queer. And I was thinking about your book and how you said you wanted to show queerness and racism in rural America, which hasn't really been done. And Sindhu, there isn't really much Tamil literature, let alone queer Tamil literature from Sri Lanka that highlights the Tamil-Sinhalese conflict, which you do try to show. So I was wondering, what and how were you trying to showcase certain kinds of representation that goes beyond queerness or makes queerness intersectional?
Well, I'm going to start with the Civil War. Sri Lanka, I think, because the wars have been going on for so long, it is impossible to write Sri Lankan characters without taking that into account, especially characters of a certain generation, like Lucky's mother. Lucky's mother's generation was the first that was born after independence and the first that really experienced life before the war and life after the war and during the war. And they are traumatized by it. They carry a lot of cultural trauma that is then passed on to their kids. And for me, I could not write the experience of the Sri Lankan immigrant in the States without also writing about the war and about what that cultural trauma looks like, what that, why they cling to each other so hard is often because they're the only ones that understand each other. And so all of those things had to go into the narrative and the story, even though it is primarily about Lucky. She has inherited a lot of that trauma as well. Even though she hasn't directly experienced the war, she's experienced her mother's trauma from the war, and she's experienced what it's like to have fewer members of a generation than you should have because we've lost so many people or people just didn't make it out. And to me, it's a lot like what the AIDS crisis has done for the queer community, where there's just a generation of people that are missing that should be here but aren't. The empty chairs in the room, And I think there's a lot of sympathy between queerness in that sense and the Sri Lankan experience because of that similar trauma of losing a lot of members of an entire generation. And I tried to sort of make that link there. And I think for me it was also important to represent different types of womanhood and different types of different ways in which women represent and express gender. So Lucky tends to be very masculine in a lot of ways, and yearns to express that masculinity. And Nisha is very, what we would call feminine, which is a double-edged sword for her because it's easier for her to blend in and pass as straight and not answer a lot of the same questions that Lucky gets asked. But it's also it becomes harder for her to assert her queerness. It becomes harder for her to come out. And there are also many other queer characters in the novel. Most of the characters in the novel are queer or of color. And there are these women that play rugby in Boston that Lucky makes friends with, and they each have different ways they experience their gender and express their gender. So for me, it was really important to have many different women in the novel, many different genders in the novel, many different races and ethnicities in the novel, and while at the same time having a lot of different representations and intersectionalities of gender.
Add something to that? Or, cool. Okay. We can start taking questions from the audience now. If you're all feeling shy, I have plenty. The mic coming your way.
Oh, hello. This is very official. So as South Asian writers living in America, writing your novels, did you like make very conscious choices that you did want to bridge countries, or did you like ever have a doubt whether you just wanted it to be set in one place simply because this is the place that you're at?
When I was growing up in West Virginia, I hardly went to India as a child. I really started going to, and I grew up with very little sense of my Indian identity because there were no other South Asians, or there were very few, and and I think also at that time our ideas about like what it meant to assimilate are really different than they are now. So I started going to India as an adult, and I think it was sort of to figure this thing out, to figure out where this place is that my parents came from. And I mean, I tie it very closely to being an artist also, and just having asking questions, So I for a long time I traveled quite frequently to India, every year or two, and I would often stay for 2 or 3 months. And for me, I think writing, because that's become such a big part of my life, I think it just naturally comes into my writing. I mean, I'm really interested in writing stories that encompass all of that, that sort of moving back and forth.
I was born in Sri Lanka, and I came here when I was a kid. So I was 7 years old when I came here. And I think I consider myself a 1.5 generation just because I do have a lot of memories of Sri Lanka. I speak Tamil fluently, and I maintain a very strong connection with the culture that, like, say, my little brother who was born here doesn't have. He isn't able to sort of see how the older generation functions. And I wanted to have both experiences here. So Lucky is more like my brother in that she is very westernized. She doesn't speak Tamil very well, and she doesn't really understand her mother. But on the other hand, there's the mother who's sort of clinging to this old culture and doesn't want to let go. And I set the story mostly in Boston because I wanted to write the story of immigration. But I also think that, and we were talking about this a little bit before, that when immigrants leave a place, that place sort of goes on pause. That place is sort of stuck in time from when they left, and they don't really move, they don't progress, even though the place is very, very different now. And so for Lucky's mother, what she's thinking of is, and what she's living in her mind is like 1992 Sri Lanka, not 2012 Sri Lanka. And so for her, it's a very different experience than it would be otherwise. So I think an immigrant story isn't really ever set in one place. It's always, there's a ghost of the old country within the story itself.
Just to jump in on that, I mean, it's really interesting that you say that because, I mean, I can really see that with my parents. I mean, their sense of what India is so sort of stuck in a certain time. And I mean, I always joke that even though they were the ones who were born and raised in India, I think I'm so much more Indian than they are at this point. I mean, they've lived in West Virginia now for 50 years, you know? And now when they go to India, they're the ones who are like, oh, it's so dirty, it's so hot. And they're like baffled by why I go to India so much. They can't figure it out. They're like, why don't you go to Venice? Why don't you go to, why don't you go to Rome? Why don't you go to, Paris? Why do you keep going to India?
Does anyone else have a question? No?
My question, well, I had two questions. One, I'm really curious, how did your family end up in West Virginia? And my second question was for Sindu, and could you talk a little bit more about what it was like writing in the present tense? You don't really see that a lot, and what was behind that, and how did you train your brain? Because it's to do that.
So my parents both grew up in Bombay, and my dad came to America when he was 17. He went to college in I think Kansas or Missouri, one of those kinds of states. And when it was time for him to get married, his parents arranged a marriage, and he married my mom, and he wanted to bring her over as quickly as he could, but he couldn't bring her over until he got a job. So he got a job, and the job was in West Virginia, and then they stayed for 50 years, and now my brother lives there, and he's staying. And yeah, I don't know. It's baffling to me that how you can go from Bombay to, but they did, and they love it there.
So I don't think and I say I don't think because I don't fully remember, but I don't think the initial drafts were in present tense. I think they were all in past tense. And I switched it over at some point because I didn't want a retrospective narrator. I didn't want the pressure of having Lucky tell her story from the future. Because I felt like at that point, if that happens, then she would color it by whatever decision she makes at the end. And I didn't want it colored. I wanted it immediate, and I wanted the reader to be fully invested because they don't know what decision she makes at the end. And that ambiguity was really important to me. And so, that's why I said it in present tense. And once I did it, it was a little tough to readjust my brain. And even then, I would write a lot of scenes in past tense and then have to change it later because I was just, we're so used to writing and reading things in past tense that, I think present it can be really hard for writers. It was hard for me anyway. But it was just, combing through, really looking at details, making sure every single thing was in present tense. And my publisher did a lot of that. My editor did a lot of that too, just to make sure everything flowed.
It's funny because I always wrote in present tense until this book. I always wrote first person present tense. Yeah. And then I wrote this crazy omniscient narration.
Well, I hope that at some point I feel the drive to write omniscient narration because I think
don't do it.
It's a challenge though.
It's being it's like you have all these voices in your head, and it's don't do it.
There's a person at the back with a question.
Hi. So Rahul, you mentioned kind of feeling more Indian than your parents. And so I'm kind of curious about how you reckon with this idea of kind of transnationality and writing kind of, as a writer, writing from a diaspora, and how you're negotiating with, your audience in India as well as your audience in the United States, and how you kind of, is that something that you take into consideration when you're writing your work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this isn't really an answer to your question, but I was, my first book actually came out in India before it came out in the U.S., and it was a shock to me that actually anyone in India even wanted it, that a publisher wanted it. And I was really proud to have that book come out in India. In some ways, I was more proud to have it published in India than I was to have it published here. And I was really proud of the way that people responded to it. I mean, it made me feel like, okay, I don't know. I mean, it made me feel like I was doing something right, or I was doing, getting at this larger experience that I think was. But to answer your question, I don't think that I really think of that consciously. And having been born and raised in the U.S., like I am an outsider in India. I unlike Sindu, I don't speak any Indian languages. So I'm very much in a lot of ways an outsider when I go, but my parents, I think at this point, are even more of outsiders than I am. So.
Just to jump off from that, I think for me, on the transnational thing, it's a little bit different. It's not really transnational in terms of thinking about an audience in Sri Lanka versus here. It's really about knowing that most of the South Asian audience here is Indian or Pakistani, and not that most Indians and Pakistanis don't really know a lot about Sri Lanka or what it is. And then being a minority within Sri Lanka itself, only about 18% of Sri Lanka is Tamil. So then, it's being minority within minority within minority, and then writing from that perspective, and then just sort of hoping that it would be universal in terms of South Asian experience, that people can relate.
That's a really good point. Thank you. We might have time for one more question.
What have you not written yet, or something that you're afraid of writing, or failed when you tried to write?
I haven't written directly about the Sri Lankan Civil War. I tried when I was in college and failed miserably because it's really hard to write about war. And at the time, I didn't have the ability as a writer to really take it on. And I still haven't written about it. My second novel's not about the war at all. But I think, at some point I will tackle this subject, and I'm really excited to. But it's also, I know, going to be very painful and going to be very scary for my parents, just because a lot of writers, journalists writing about the war aren't really welcomed back in Sri Lanka the same way that you are if you never write about the war at all. So it is in the future for me, and I'm really excited to do it.
I guess I don't know if this is quite an answer to your question, but I've been trying to write. I think both of my books do this, and I think a lot of my work tries to do this. Trying to make sense of sort of my experience of growing up brown and queer in West Virginia, and at that time. And I think I've represented it in certain ways that I think have been important for me to have been important for me to process, which, in one way or another, I think I've written about a lot of the ways that I think that myself and my family experienced racism and discrimination, not necessarily in super overt ways, but in these sort of like microaggressions. In ways that kind of erased, our experiences or who we are. But I think what I haven't written about and actually what I'm sort of trying to write about a little bit now in an essay is all of the ways in which I was and have been guilty of discrimination myself toward those communities, or toward a lot of the communities. I mean, for instance, I cringe when I think about how many years I spoke the phrase "poor white trash" without ever thinking about it, right? Without ever thinking about how offensive and upsetting that term is. And I think that there are all kinds of ways in which myself, the South Asian community that I know in West Virginia, is guilty of not fully seeing the people around them either. And so that's something that I want to try to write about more.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul and Sindhu. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Their books are available behind you. If you ask nicely, they might sign it for you. Thank you, everyone.